Trying to make sense of this battle between the White House and a single reporter.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Of course, the big question is it about a single reporter? In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. We've been trying to pick the brains of both legal scholars and journalists and journalism professors on both the radio and television shows regarding this Jim Acosta thing that got resolved sort of on Friday afternoon, but we've since learned that perhaps it's not resolved. So follow the bouncing ball and get on the roller coaster, right, with Donald Trump. Great to have you aboard. Thank you for joining us on this Monday evening of Thanksgiving week. By the way, Kev, I know you're off this week. The Patriots had a bye, but the Giants are they're making the move, you know.
Okay.
I'm just,
you keep telling yourself that.
Did you hear that? He said to keep telling myself that. 3-7, baby. We actually have a shot, I'm telling you. Anyway, let's take a look at today's headline to start this conversation. I'll tell you, the president just riffs and riffs and riffs. There were about 17 conversations that came out of his interview with Fox News. Here's the best summary we can give you.
President Trump says a full report on the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi is coming today or tomorrow. On Fox News Sunday, Mr. Trump says he was briefed on the tape of the killing, but doesn't need to hear it.
It's a suffering tape. It's a terrible tape. I've been fully briefed on it. There's no reason for me to hear it.
He didn't say whether the report on Khashoggi would be made public. Also during the interview, Mr. Trump admitted he was thinking about changing 3 to 5 positions on his cabinet. Chief of Staff John Kelly could be one of them.
John at some point is going to want to move on. John will move on.
The president also spoke about Veterans Day and not visiting Arlington National Cemetery.
In retrospect, I should have, and I did last year, and I will virtually every year.
And when asked about CNN reporter Jim Acosta, whose White House access pass was recently revoked, the president floated the idea of turning off cameras at his press conferences that face reporters, limiting their airtime.
He just wants to keep digging in on this argument. I really don't understand. I'll tell you that there were literally a half a dozen major conversations that came out of this Fox News piece. The first being that this journalist who was literally, well, we don't have to define how he met his demise, but I think you understand how it happened. We have Republicans in the U.S. Senate who are suggesting that the relationship between the Crown Prince and the United States is over. So legislatively, we are going to see some things happening there while the president continues to hold on to the notion that that relationship has to remain intact. And that he didn't listen to the tape is some people could consider him weak for not listening to the tape. If he doesn't want to listen to the tape, that's fine. Maybe he wants to listen to the CIA. That might be a good place to start, don't you think? In the meantime, he's got a headline here coming out of this interview. He's going after the general who organized and executed the entire capture and demise of Osama bin Laden, suggesting that it wasn't on time, took too long. But I mean, and here's where he doesn't understand. Even with his base, he has no credibility. People look at that and say, who died and made him the retroactive analyst of things back then, when frankly there's stuff under his nose that he doesn't understand. This presidency continues to be a burden to the American public. If we didn't have the economic numbers that we have and a couple of the wins that the president obviously does have, this place would be a disaster right now. 2020 is something that he really ought to pay attention to, but for some reason he still thinks he's got a big win. There'll be near 40 seats, by the way, in Congress that will have been changed before we're done with this whole thing. In the meantime, Monica Lewinsky's headline is this kind of lingering headache for Bill Clinton. She continues to speak out in this A&E investigation documentary that aired this weekend.
It's not as if it didn't register with me that he was the president. Obviously it did. But I think in one way, the moment we were actually in the back office for the first time, the truth is that I think it meant more to me that someone who other people desired me.
Okay, Monica, okay. I understand it's a whole purge, and I get it. And you know what? She has a right to stand up and try to reclaim her identity and to try to flip this thing that happened 20 years ago known as the Lewinsky scandal to the Clinton affair, which is what is the title of this journalistic series. I understand why she's doing it. She has every right to do it. She's got a First Amendment right. And how would you like to be her? She can't go anywhere still 20 years later without being noted for this particular thing. And he never let her off the hook. He never made the kind of affirmative apology to America, but more specifically to her. 20 years to this day, the impeachment process began on Bill Clinton. And 20 years later, this guy still hasn't been able to make it right. It's too bad. All right, let's take a look at the conversation of the day and the headline from Friday. We'll have ensuing headlines still because this thing is just kind of taking on a new life again. But the judge, I thought, for me, on both radio and television, I was opining last week that I didn't think this was going to go this way. I thought that the president's arguments and the Justice Department's defense of the lawsuit by CNN against CNN's litigation against the White House and the defense of it seemed to make sense to me, as much as I didn't like it. Linda Levin is a journalism professor, retired from URI now for a few years, goes way back in State House coverage and municipal coverage here, and has taught a lot of pretty good journalists over the course of time out of URI. Welcome to the broadcast. Thank you for joining us. What's your gut check on this CNN Acosta story? We'll talk more about it as we go, but what's your executive summary if you have one?
My executive summary on all of this, everything that's coming out of Washington, is it's madness. I can't predict 95% of the stories that are emerging from the White House, and I've covered a lot of politics over the years. I have written about presidents. I've been a presidential scholar, researcher, and it boggles my mind what comes out of this White House on a daily basis.
Yeah, no doubt. Specifically on the Acosta story, what is your gut call on this?
I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. He's changed his mind again now and said he'll consider giving him back his credentials. Will he? Who knows?
All right, we'll break. We'll come back and we'll talk more in depth about some of the arguments on either side. Stay with us. So in case you've been snoozing, here's what happened last week.
CNN reporter Jim Acosta needed a court order to get back into the White House, and he got it.
This is just any other day here at the White House for me. I would get back to work.
CNN's lawsuit alleges that Acosta's First and Fifth Amendment rights were violated when the White House took away his credentials. Judge Timothy Kelly didn't rule on the underlying case Friday morning, but said CNN was likely to prevail on its Fifth Amendment claim because Acosta did not receive an explanation as to why his credentials were revoked, nor was he given the opportunity to rebut the White House's decision.
That's enough. I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am.
The White House claims it made the decision after Acosta refused to surrender a microphone during a press conference last week.
In response, the White House says it's creating rules for future press conferences, saying there needs to be some decorum.
We want total freedom of the press. It's very important to me. It's more important to me than anybody would believe. But you have to act with respect. You're in the White House.
President Trump hinted that the White House could try to revoke Acosta's pass again in the future.
They don't listen to the rules and regulations. We'll end up back in court and we'll win.
Many news organizations, including CBS News, filed friend of the court briefs in support of CNN's lawsuit to defend its constitutional rights.
You get all that? This is going to be a good exercise. This is an opportunity for American citizens to actually check in to their own use of media, their understanding of journalism, and some of the legal issues that surround the constitutional arguments, for, pro and against here. Here's a headline that came out following the production of that package on the idea that CNN might have another battle. This emergency hearing that's now been asked for today, because the president is still talking about revoking Jim Acosta's press pass. In fact, the letter was sent to Acosta after that judge's decision, putting him on notice. And it seems to me that they were probably looking to cover their tails on some Fifth Amendment due process. Professor, do you have any thought on the difference between the First Amendment and Fifth Amendment arguments that were woven into this story?
This is a very tricky issue. Most presidents, I think, would have, in this case, simply asked other reporters to ask questions, ignored him, and he would have had to sit down. Instead, Trump engaged in a dialogue, an argument with him, and I think that just made the whole issue fester and was really a lot worse than it would have been. You're
talking about the actual event itself.
The event itself.
Right.
So what came out of that then was, is this a lack of due process? No doubt. He didn't give him any reason other than that he thought he was a rude, I've forgotten the words he used, rude something or other, and told him to leave.
Yeah.
Revoked his credentials. The First Amendment issue is an interesting one because the right of free press, does that mean that anyone who holds a press conference, any public official, can ask a journalist to leave for one reason or another? Is that violating the First Amendment? I'm not sure it is. It's his press conference. If he doesn't want a journalist in there, I think it was the way he did it, the way he handled it, that made it much worse than it would have been had he just kind of made it a low-key issue.
Yeah, there's an argument the Defense Department is used, I should say the Justice Department, in defense of this action by CNN to get the temporary restraining order, to get the pass back into Acosta's briefcase, or around his neck, as the case may be. That suggests that the president doesn't have an obligation to talk to anybody. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. I made a
We had a lot of reporters in that room, many reporters in that room, and they were unable to ask questions because this guy gets up and starts, doing what he's supposed to be doing for him and for CNN, and, just shouting out questions. But I will say this, look, nobody believes in the First Amendment more than I do, and if I think somebody's acting out of sorts, I will leave. I'll say, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate you coming, and I'll leave. And those reporters will not be too friendly to whoever it is that's acting up.
Yeah, I understand his point there. By the way, the president once again adds into his list of superlatives as nobody more than me. Nobody, it doesn't matter. Nobody likes turkey at Thanksgiving more than I do. Nobody loves, Chevrolet more than I do, or apple pie more than I do. Nobody loves putting their shoes on in the morning more than I do. I mean, it's just
it's his modus operandi.
Well, yeah, it's his default in conversation, right? So I mean, it's just where his brain operates, because he's got to be the best at everything that's going on, and the most important. His defense from the Justice Department suggested that the president has no obligation to talk to the press at all.
That's true.
And I think that's true.
Yes. And there have been presidents who have simply not wanted to hold press conferences, or have held very few.
Right. So go back to your journalism professor role, and a kid in class asks you, so professor, what is the First Amendment issue here? Your answer would be?
I'm not sure there is one, because CNN could send anyone else in to cover that press conference. they could send another reporter in. They don't have to send Acosta in to cover press conferences. They didn't, the president didn't tell CNN they couldn't broadcast anything that went on in that press conference or anything that Acosta said.
Right. Yet the judge spent some time talking about Fifth Amendment due process violations that were, you know, egregious for Acosta in his role as a journalist, and journalistic organizations applauded the judge for protecting them. The judge didn't see that because CNN's got 50 other press pass reporters that CNN was protected. What the judge was saying, in addition to his Fifth Amendment process, was that CNN makes the decisions on who their reporters are.
Yes, of
not
course.
the president.
That's true.
And this common area of reporting, once the White House is established, true, they don't have to have briefings, but once they establish a common place for general reporting on the White House, that's where the First Amendment arguments come in, according to the judge.
Yes, and I think that the president is on to something when he says that he ought to set up rules and regulations for press conferences.
Well, he was instructed to do so by the judge.
And had they had those rules and regulations in place, but I think that this really came down to a very belligerent president who likes to have the last word on everything, who is very angry at CNN. He's angry at any news outlet who writes or broadcasts anything negative, even remotely negative about him. I think this was just an inevitable event. It was going to happen.
Tell me about, I think there's some really interesting things here in terms of the public's acumen for journalism and journalists' acumen for their own industry and practice. I see it waning. Do you?
I think so,
An
yes.
understanding of the business.
Well, yes, I think journalists need to be more aware of their rights, and the public really,
and maybe their responsibilities.
And their responsibilities, being fair and accurate. And I think the public has never really been told. It's the fault of the news media, and I have talked to students about this, I've talked to other journalists about this, the fact that the news media has never really taken the time, and I say broadcast and print are both at fault, for not explaining to the public how they gather and report the news and what they go through to do this. Alan Rosenberg, the editor of the Journal, on Sundays now is attempting to do some of that in this column that he writes every Sunday on how the Journal gets a certain story or what's going on behind the scenes. And I think the news media really have an obligation today, especially in everything that's going on with the news media and the White House, to really explain to the public what it all means. How do we get our news? How do we get this news that we're broadcasting to you? How do we get these stories we're writing about? And what
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Is this the hangover over the fake news allegation and a response to it?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it.
But what instruction do you want from the journalistic community to its consumers that they're not providing already?
I think a little more discussion at some point in a story or a sidebar, how we got this story, what it all means, what we went through to get it,
naming
and why
sources,
it's important.
Of course not.
Pardon?
You don't want them to name sources that they're protecting.
No, that's a totally different issue.
Well, I'm trying.
But explaining why they need to use sources.
Okay.
I have a friend out in the Middle West who's very, very, very conservative, and he's very angry at the liberal media, as he calls it, and one of the problems that he has is that they use unnamed sources. Now, journalists could probably not get a lot of the stories in Washington if they didn't use unnamed sources. But can we explain that to the public a little bit of why we need to get those unnamed sources? We're not doing anything illegal. We're not violating the First Amendment by doing that.
Yeah, it's a really deep conversation because the we thing, you know, who's we? There's established media and established journalists, and then there's the ad hoc internet-based type of organizations that will be, making up their own rules as they go along. And it really is up to the consumer right now to be more informed about where they place their trusts.
But how do they get informed? They need to. One of the problems is that if journalists today, and let's stick with the sort of mainstream journalists, not the fringe internet people, if they're not explaining and giving, for one thing, context even to what's going on in Washington, what does this all mean? Why did this come about? And some news media outlets are doing that, and they have the time and the space to do that, and some simply don't. I could go on for days about this issue. There's no doubt that cable television, 24-hour newscasts are spending a lot of time giving consumers information that may or may not be accurate. They're giving them information, but not necessarily context.
Yeah, the business has evolved, and the pressure of 24-hour cycles, I think, has been well handled at times and not so well handled at times. And the other thing is that back in your day and mine, when we were pressing a source, even the governor or the president or a senator on an issue, our interrogative process wasn't published. So we would, there are Jim Acostas and Sam Donaldsons and all the way back, people who bust horns to get a story and didn't do it politely. But now we have press conferences that are broadcast, and so you're seeing the sausage being made, and now the sausage being made is actually part of the process of evaluating the journalism. Donald Trump didn't throw Jim Acosta out for what he reported. He threw him out for how he asked the questions.
Well, you mentioned Sam Donaldson, perfect example. Another reporter that irritated the White House beyond belief, but they didn't treat him the way that Trump has treated Acosta. And I think that whole issue, again, could have been handled differently by the president.
I only got 15 seconds here. Where are we going? What do you think on this whole story? Is it going to get better or worse?
I think that anytime anyone really seriously annoys the president, someone in the media, I think they're going to be in trouble with the president. How it's handled, will it always go to court? Maybe not.
It's not good.
Not good. I wouldn't want to be covering the White House right now. Well, maybe I would.
Thanks for your expertise. Appreciate it. Final word when we come back. It's interesting that the professor suggests that we spend, or the journalists spend more time explaining how they do their work. That's not a bad idea. I'll tell you, there's going to have to be some trust built back between consumers of news and news producers on all platforms. What's really scary is that latest data shows that more people trust the news that's passed on to them from friends on Facebook than they do traditional media sources. Yikes. That's all I have to say about that. We'll follow this saga as we go. Keep getting prepared for the holiday. Don't let it crawl up on you. It takes a while to get that turkey ready. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 on WPRO, and back here tomorrow night with Central Falls Mayor James Diosa.